I believe that communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written. They are the focus of evil in the modern world. But before things get too far out of hand,
Но пока не слишком уж далеко мы зайдем.
I would find ourselves standing like this.
Мы лучше вот так вот стоим, хорошо?
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
About 3 seconds. Firing. That's it.
December 1985. A test of a device built in response to President Reagan's call. It was a demonstration designed to get on the evening news, promotion for the Strategic Defense Initiative.
You might be able to get a good shot. You go right down through the hole here. Watch out, it's on!
The device is called a railgun. The hole it created in a steel plate was made by a plastic projectile accelerated between rails to 6,000 miles an hour. The goal of the research, a weapon in space able to shoot holes in Soviet missiles, part of a defensive shield over America.
Go ahead, take it down.
The Strategic Defense Initiative was President Reagan's attempt to use technology to escape from the nuclear age, to make America's safety no longer dependent on decisions made in Moscow.
And let's just hope that this tool can someday be used to tame warfare and perhaps even someday eliminate the threat of nuclear destruction. So I propose this toast to that end result.
3 years later, the president's vision of a space shield had been brought back to Earth. January 20th, 1981, Inauguration Day for the 8th president of the nuclear age. The skies over the Capitol were cold and gray, reflecting the national mood during the last few weeks of the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan had been swept into office on a promise to restore America's self-confidence, battered by a faltering economy and the Iran hostage crisis. In accepting the Republican nomination, Reagan had sounded a major theme: to make America again strong and secure.
It is the responsibility of the President of the United States in working for peace to ensure that the safety of our people cannot successfully be threatened by a hostile foreign power. As President, fulfilling that responsibility will be my #1 priority.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office.
30 years earlier, Ronald Reagan, the actor, cut his political teeth helping purge the movie industry of communism. His first public elective office was as governor of California from 1967 to 1973.
Governor Reagan, I now declare you to be duly installed as governor of the state of California.
Anti-communism was a keynote of the career that led to the White House. A week after becoming president, Reagan said this of the Soviet leadership:
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, in order to attain that, and that is moral, not immoral.
This view of the Soviet Union was shared by his foreign policy advisors.
The policy was that the Soviet Union was a fundamental enemy of the United States and the West and our way of life. And it tried to influence our policies in their interest, largely by attaining military superiority.
Added to that, there was the psychological burden of the Iran hostage-taking and our helplessness in the face of that, a sense that drift in the Carter administration had left us without much prestige, unrespected in the world, and certainly diminished as a military power.
Now, to overcome this, we had to first of all free ourselves of the détente ideology, which assumed that we have basic fundamental interests, namely to preserve peace in the world, and also to beef up very considerably our armed forces so they were not liable to blackmail.
For the Reagan team, the instruments of potential Soviet blackmail were the large land-based missiles the Soviet Union had been building steadily during the 1970s. These missiles were permitted under the unratified SALT II arms limitation agreement negotiated by President Carter. But to the Reagan administration, the missiles' power and accuracy threatened to give the Soviets nuclear superiority. Early in his presidency, Reagan held a fog-shrouded press conference at his Santa Barbara ranch.
The Soviet Union has been engaged in the greatest military buildup in the history of man. And it cannot be described as necessary for their defense. It is plainly a buildup that is offensive in nature.
By the middle of the 80s, 1985, 1986, we will clearly be second in military power to the Soviet Union, with all of the consequences that that would entail for our security, the cohesion of our alliances, and the worldwide protection of our own interests.
When we got here in 1981, we found that all three parts of the triad of strategic offensive deterrence were getting old, getting less effective, and had to be renewed. And it was our unhappy fate that we had to renew all three parts of it at once.
At the center of Reagan's strategic modernization plan was the new multi-warhead MX missile, begun by Carter, but whose deployment was now to be accelerated. The Trident II submarine program, with its highly accurate nuclear missiles, would also be speeded up. The B-1 bomber, which had been canceled by President Carter, was to be reinstated. The military use of space would be expanded as part of a major reinvestment in the technology, such as surveillance and communication satellites, needed to manage and command a nuclear conflict. The new weaponry and the new policy was to give the United States the means to prevail in a protracted nuclear war. The winter of 1981 saw the beginnings of a grassroots campaign against the nuclear buildup.
Request the President of the United States to propose to the Soviet Union a mutual freeze on the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons and missiles and new aircraft.
Well, the freeze movement had been around for a while, but I believe they were to some extent galvanized by Ronald Reagan's rhetoric. The evil empire rhetoric, the loose talk about limited nuclear war, just the general attitude about the Soviet Union, about the military buildup, the talk about prevailing in a nuclear war, which sounded an awful lot like winning. It was difficult to tell some subtle difference between those terms. I think the freeze movement was a plea to do something about this rather than a specific arms control proposal.
It was a plea that first made itself heard in several local non-binding referendums, then leapt to the talk show circuit.
In order to stop this arms race, you first got to freeze it. You gotta, like an elevator, you gotta stop it before it can go back down again.
The government is not in favor of a nuclear freeze, which would preserve the superiority the Soviet Union currently enjoys.
Why don't we seek negotiations for a freeze now and carry on to reductions? That way we can halt the making of doomsday weapons and save billions to help poor people.
Helen, I know that there are people that have tried to figure this out. The truth of the matter is that, on balance, the Soviet Union does have a definite margin of superiority.
The sense that a struggle for nuclear superiority was underway, and that this was a struggle without meaning and without end, swelled the freeze movement.
Can't blame it on Einstein, can't blame it on anyone. Don't look to find the blame, look to shut down and bomb. Missiles whistle and the Holocaust is on. It's too late to wait, we gotta eliminate the bomb.
In the summer of 1982, over 500,000 demonstrators marched in New York City. It wasn't just the arms buildup that brought them. It was the sense, too, that this administration, unlike its predecessors, had little interest in negotiating with the Soviet Union. In Geneva, talks on reducing strategic arms were stalled.
Once more, please.
Hostage to an ailing leadership in Moscow and hostility within the administration to the basic tenets of the arms control process.
I don't believe that our security has ever depended on concluding agreements with the Soviet Union. And indeed, the principal arms control agreements in the decade and a half preceding the Reagan administration barely touched the Soviet weapons program and barely touched our own. We built what we had it in mind to build, and the Soviets built what they had it in mind to build, and with or without those agreements, the resulting nuclear forces on the two sides would have been pretty much the same.
Soviet and American negotiators have been engaged in attempts to restrain the arms race since the 1960s. The one treaty still in force was concluded in 1972, limiting each side's freedom to deploy defenses against nuclear missiles. Both nations had developed anti-ballistic missile systems. The American one employed rockets designed to intercept warheads in space. There was also a backup interceptor, intended to pick off the warheads the first missiles had missed. Both interceptors were to use nuclear explosions to destroy the incoming warheads. But even this two-layer defense would be much too leaky to stop an all-out attack. So in 1969, President Nixon decided to use it not to protect people, but instead to defend our own offensive missiles.
There is no way that we can adequately defend our cities without an unacceptable loss of life. The only way that I have concluded that we can save lives, which is the primary purpose of our defense system, is to prevent war. And that is why the emphasis of this system is on protecting our deterrent, which is the best preventive for war.
Construction began of an ABM system to defend a missile field in North Dakota. It was an act that acknowledged what seemed an immutable consequence of the awesome power of nuclear weapons. Technology can't protect people. At best, it can preserve deterrence by ensuring our ability to strike back if attacked. In the nuclear age, the only role for a shield is to protect the sword. Meanwhile, President Nixon and Soviet leader Brezhnev had signed the 1972 ABM Pact, limiting each side's ability to defend itself. The treaty was designed to stop an escalating struggle between offense and defense, but it also acknowledged that each side's survival was in the hands of the other. For a decade, the central assumption of mutual assured destruction, that only the certainty it would itself be destroyed prevented the Soviet Union from launching its missiles went largely unchallenged. But in the Reagan White House, with its view of Soviet morality, the notion that nothing but Soviet self-interest stood between its missiles and American cities was appalling.
Mutual assured destruction, the threat to destroy the civilian population of the Soviet Union, which is what it amounts to, if they attack us, assumes that they will make a rational calculation that they would rather not be destroyed, and that suffering their own destruction is too high a price to pay for the privilege of attacking us. That, I believe, is one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan would like to move to a strategic posture that is less dependent on decisions made in Moscow and on decisions that over which we have no direct control.
It is inconceivable to me that we can go on thinking down the future, not only for ourselves in our lifetime, but for other generations, that the great nations of the world will sit here like people facing themselves across a table, each with a cocked gun, and no one knowing whether someone might tighten their finger on the trigger.
Back in the Washington of early 1983, the freeze movement was helping galvanize growing congressional opposition to the president's strategic modernization program.
Today is free. I wish that we had an administration that was more concerned with preventing nuclear war and less concerned in preparing for nuclear war.
What neither the freeze supporters or almost anyone else knew was that the president indeed had a plan for preventing war. A plan that for the first time in the nuclear age renounced the assumptions of mutual assured destruction.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Even many of the president's advisors were astonished by the speech.
I can say with higher certainty than I can say of any other thing I saw in my years in the White House, that there never was any single initiative taken by the Reagan administration that was so thoroughly created and invented in Ronald Reagan's own mind and experiences. It was his decision, it was his creation, and it was aided and assisted by others, but nevertheless, it was his deep set of experiences that were acquired during the first 2 years of strategic modernization and the difficulties that surrounded it that led him to take that step that very few of his advisors encouraged him to take.
I was stunned to read the paragraphs at the end that announced the launching of the Strategic Defense Initiative. It wasn't called that in that speech. We tried to call it that later. It ended up getting called Star Wars. I think that was predictable. But it seemed to me unwise to launch a program of those dimensions without any advanced preparation, without consultations with Congress, without consultations with our allies, without defining carefully the plan that we were going to pursue.
I asked my daddy what this Star Wars stuff is all about. He said
this commercial captured for most what the president seemed to have in mind.
And that's why the president wants to build a peace shield. It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house. Then, nobody could win a war.
The idea that we could perhaps build an impenetrable shield against nuclear missiles had many origins. One was the organization High Frontier. For months, it had lobbied the administration on behalf of a space-based defense against nuclear missiles. It argued that the limitations of the old ABM-type defenses could be transcended by a network in space able to attack Soviet missiles as soon as they were launched.
When the network detects the launch of a Soviet ICBM, computers acquire the missile track and send interceptors to destroy the missile during its initial boost phase.
The interceptor rockets of the High Frontier Plan were too slow to be effective. But the idea of basing exotic new weapons in space, weapons much more powerful and prompt than rockets, weapons like lasers, particle beams, and rail guns, quickly became the heart of the president's Strategic Defense Initiative. Of all the technologies imagined, the boldest involved building immense lasers on the ground, bouncing their beams between mirrors in space and then on to the Soviet rockets as they emerged through the atmosphere. Lasers of the type needed for such a scheme were already being researched at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the place the atom bomb had been invented.
That's terrible, isn't it? You say you don't want to use the Higgins circuit? We can go down a little if you want.
The laser research here began before the SDI, and with other goals than shooting down Soviet missiles. The scientists had mixed feelings about the new direction their research was taking and its prospects for success.
All right, see what you can do. We're sure to be able in the next few years to shoot down at least a few missiles. If somebody without authorization or accidentally shot off a few missiles on either side, we could shoot those down and prevent World War III from happening. That alone would justify Star Wars, in my opinion. But surely we're going to do better than that. And with time, the system will get more and more reliable, more and more capable. It's just going to take time and money.
I think it's too shallow, too mechanistic an attempt to solve our problems. I don't think it'll work. If I were an enemy, I'd put a bomb on a boat in the harbor. And then the SDI does you no good. I think that would be just as much of a threat. So I don't think it's, I think it's a shallow technical fix, and I don't think that's what we need.
Why don't you go back to your previous setting? We'll help you, Ted.
Call it good then?
But the idea that technology could neutralize missiles had powerful appeal. And hadn't American technology landed a man on the moon?
Missile defense is not like going to the moon, where year by year your ability to go to the moon cheaply and safely increases because technology gets better and better. But the moon doesn't get better and better at evading you or shooting back at you or doing anything. It's different when you're competing against the Russians. Their technology gets better at the same time your technology is getting better. So you're competing with an intelligent, dynamic opponent, another human being.
In Moscow, reaction to the Strategic Defense Initiative among those whose job it would be to counter it was surprise, bordering on disbelief. Raul Sedeyev.
First conclusion was that technologically it would be extremely difficult to produce a system which could make nuclear arms obsolete and impotent. Especially if you would consider the level of overkill which exists nowadays. So you would need to produce almost impermeable shield, which is impossible.
There are many ways the Soviets could make sure an impermeable shield is impossible. One exploits the inherent vulnerability of weapons in space. They can be destroyed with space mines. Or the Soviets could upgrade their missiles to make them faster and less vulnerable to laser attack. The simplest countermeasure was to build more missiles to overwhelm the defense. But any response would pose a formidable challenge to a nation that had already spent billions of rubles to match America's nuclear capability.
That for most of the nuclear age, the Russians were indeed overwhelmingly inferior and we superior. They finally felt they had caught up, and now maybe they could have a breathing spell. And instead, was this a possibility that now we were going to start a new phase in both offenses and defenses.
It was a challenge the Soviet Union was ill-prepared to face. Brezhnev was dead, and the latest leader, Andropov, was ailing. SDI was only one more complication in a Soviet-American relationship that was rapidly deteriorating. In September 1983, a Soviet fighter shot down a Korean airliner.
For those Americans who are outraged with the murders of 269 people, to show that outrage through actions and not just words.
And that winter, the Russians walked out of the Geneva arms negotiations.
Vitinsky, can you tell us, did you walk out? Is it all over?
The issue was the NATO allies' decision to deploy intermediate-range and cruise missiles in Europe.
That the present round of the negotiations is discontinued without any date set for their resumption.
Many saw the world situation as potentially catastrophic. President Reagan was an exception.
Senator Byrd says that our relations with the Soviet Union have reached the lowest point in 20 years. And 6 eminent world leaders today said that we're headed for global suicide. What are you going to do about it with this arms race?
I don't think we are, and I don't think we're any closer or as close as we might have been in the past. But when they're ready to come back to the table, it probably or might not be till after the election, I don't know. But I think that the world maybe is a little safer than it has been in the past.
A few months later, the president began his campaign for re-election.
The president kicked off a fall offensive designed to get his second-term presidency off the defensive.
Well, I'm back and raring to go, up for the battle that's only just begun.
But it was a battle the Strategic Defense Initiative had been helpful in redefining. The freeze movement, so powerful only 2 years earlier, had been finessed. The president could now speak gracefully of a new kind of peaceful coexistence.
A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Wouldn't it be far more humanitarian to say that now we can defend against a nuclear war by destroying missiles instead of slaughtering millions of people?
So help me God. Congratulations, sir.
Reagan was re-elected by one of the largest landslides in American history. But Congress was increasing pressure on the administration to bargain seriously once more with the Soviet Union on strategic arms. Reagan responded with an offer of a summit.
We will meet with the Soviets hoping that we can agree on a way to rid the world of the threat of nuclear destruction.
Three months later, a summit became almost inevitable when Mikhail Gorbachev was elected Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's goal of reinvigorating the Soviet Union politically and economically required better relations with Washington and limits on the arms race. But almost at once, President Reagan's SDI proved a stumbling block. Gorbachev proposed deep cuts in offensive strategic weapons, but only if the SDI were limited to laboratory research. Reagan proposed that strategic defenses should be the substance of the summit.
I think at this summit meeting, what we should take up is the matter of turning toward defensive weapons as an alternative to this just plain naked nuclear threat of each side saying we can blow up the other.
The two leaders met in Geneva in the fall of 1985. Their first meeting, scheduled for 15 minutes, lasted an hour. To everyone's surprise, Reagan and Gorbachev seemed quickly to establish a warm, personal relationship.
Ракет
The main thing I felt in Geneva was that two such unalike leaders could find a common language. I felt that we were at the brink of some kind of fundamental breakthrough in Soviet-American relations.
But the breakthrough did not lead to agreement. Reagan refused to limit SDI, and Gorbachev refused offensive cuts.
At this meeting, it was not possible to reach a solution.
I don't think they produced very much, so to say, in very concrete terms. But there was some principal agreements on a few very important issues. One of them, that you cannot win a nuclear war and you shouldn't fight a nuclear war. And they agreed to meet again.
On President Reagan's return to Washington, Congress gave him the biggest ovation of his presidency. The sense of relief was palpable. The president carried no agreement, but the dark days and darker visions of U.S.-Soviet relations seemed over.
Thank you. Thank you.
I look forward to welcoming Mr. Gorbachev to the United States next year. And I have accepted his invitation to go to Moscow the following year.
The president also reported on an extraordinary offer he had made to the Soviet leader.
I promised that if our research reveals that a defense against nuclear missiles is possible, we would sit down with our allies and the Soviet Union to see how together we could replace all strategic ballistic missiles with such a defense which threatens no one.
Few statements by the president so revealed the romanticism of his vision for the SDI. But this was a time when he was trying to restrict Soviet access to existing American technology.
Therefore, to think that there will be a comprehensive exchange of the most classified, latest technology would be, of course, a very naive and totally baseless idea.
Even if certain dedicated technology could be shared, very difficult to separate, to draw the line between SDI technology and other military applications.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, meanwhile, was gearing up. A flying visit by the head of the SDI, General James Abramson, to dedicate a new research facility at Martin Marietta's astronautics group near Denver, was typical of the high profile the SDI was then seeking.
Congratulations to Martin and to all of us, and frankly, to the nation.
I thank you very much.
Events like this were designed to help secure funding for what had become the Pentagon's largest research program, now universally called Star Wars.
But the one good thing, and I've said this, and maybe some of you have even heard me say it, the one real relationship to not only that movie, but perhaps others, is that the good guys won. And the good guys won because of the force that was with them. Well, you see here today, amongst the people that are working on this facility and have created technical marvels before that, the force that is going to make this more safe, this secure world really possible.
But by now, the way strategic defense would increase security was being redefined and the president's vision reinterpreted.
The president gave us a very demanding challenge, and that was to find a way to counter those missiles. On the other hand, he nor anyone else never indicated that something had to be absolutely perfect. There's nothing that's perfect in this world. But long before you reach the level of a perfect defense, you achieve a point where the military planners on the other side can never be sure of achieving their military objective. And when you've reached that point, you truly have an effective deterrent?
I think the President set for the Strategic Defense Initiative a goal that can't possibly be realized in the near future, if it can ever be realized, of a perfect defense, an impenetrable shield. It seems to me unlikely that we will be able to achieve that level of perfection in any weapon system, offensive or defensive. Nevertheless, a partially effective strategic defense, one that would intercept, let's say, half the missiles aimed at the United States in a deliberate attack, would destroy the effectiveness of that attack. It would not achieve its objectives if the objectives were to destroy the American capacity to retaliate.
Speaking of the administration's current interpretation, the idea that limited defenses make the outcome of a nuclear attack uncertain and so stabilize the existing system of reciprocal restraint, I think their conclusions are wrong. A limited defense does not stabilize the system, but quite the opposite. It destabilizes it.
These arguments echo those made 15 years earlier and concern whether defending missiles, like the new MX, weakens or strengthens deterrence. What is significant is that administration officials had returned to this argument to justify the SDI, because the President had said he wanted to replace deterrence, not preserve it, that he wanted a defense designed to make nuclear missiles impotent and obsolete, not one designed to protect them. And he was still saying that.
2 years ago, I challenged our scientific community to use their talents and energies to find a way that we might eventually rid ourselves of the need for nuclear weapons, starting with ICBMs. We seek to render obsolete the balance of terror, or mutual assured destruction as it's called, and replace it with a system incapable of initiating armed conflict or causing mass destruction, yet effective in preventing war. Now, this is not and should never be misconstrued as just another method of protecting missile silos. The Strategic Defense Initiative has been labeled Star Wars, but it isn't about war. It's about peace. It isn't about retaliation. It's about prevention. It isn't about fear. It's about hope. And in that struggle, if you'll pardon my stealing a film line, the force is with us.
It was the first public demonstration of a device called an electromagnetic launcher. The projectile traveled...
On the evening news, the force was gathering momentum.
Like this in a 1-inch thick steel plate. Scientists here say they have made impressive strides during the past 9 months developing the railgun. But it's likely to be 10 years, they say, before it could be ready for possible use as part of the Star Wars defense system.
Other demonstrations, such as a giant laser's effect on an empty rocket booster, also looked impressive.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff of Delta 180 and its SDI payload.
Delta 180, launched in September 1986, was to become the high point of the Strategic Defense Initiative during the Reagan years. Once in orbit, its payload separated into 2 stages. One pulled away till the objects were 120 miles apart. The second stage then turned around and searched for the other stage with its sensor. This task is similar to tracking a warhead from space against the Earth as a background. Then, the second stage looked for a small rocket launched from Earth and successfully spotted the hot plume of its rocket engine as it rose through the atmosphere. Delta 180 showed that simple sensors could perform at least some of the sensing and tracking tasks needed in a space-based defense, and concluded with a head-on collision simulating an intercept. Down on Earth, the SDI still remained an obstacle to the scheduled Washington summit. Soviet leader Gorbachev instead proposed an interim meeting in Iceland, bringing with him a large staff and a comprehensive disarmament proposal.
the main goal was to shake up the whole situation, to really get out of this, absolutely fruitless discussions and negotiations, which led nowhere, which were sham negotiations sometimes.
President Reagan arrived with a small team, expecting a general conversation on a wide range of issues.
Gorbachev began his presentation on his package of arms control proposals. Now, that was surprising to us for its scope, because it was comprehensive.
Gorbachev proposed a 50% cut in long-range weapons, the elimination of mid-range missiles in Europe, and a 10-year commitment to the ABM Treaty, which bans space-based weapons.
Mr. President, have you made any real progress, sir? We're not through. Are you going to meet again, sir? Yes. This afternoon? Making headway at least.
The final meeting proved to be one of the most breathtaking of the nuclear age. Reagan proposed abiding by the ABM Treaty for 10 years if both countries eliminated all of their ballistic missiles. Gorbachev, in that final meeting, raised the stakes still higher. He proposed eliminating all nuclear weapons in 10 years, but again, only if the Americans would agree to strict limits on developing and testing strategic defense.
And in the end, it was deadlocked. I mean, it was gridlocked on that issue. Both leaders felt that they could not return to their capitals, having made a concession on that issue. And they tried. I mean, they urged each other to make that one concession. And after a while, after quite a while, it became apparent that that was not going to be possible. So at a certain point, the books were closed and they stood up and left.
There was some frustration on both sides, because it looked so that the goal is so close, you just can't grasp it.
While both sides seek reduction in the number of nuclear missiles and warheads threatening the world, the Soviet Union insisted that we sign an agreement that would deny to me and to future presidents for 10 years the right to develop, test, and deploy a defense against nuclear missiles for the people of the free world. This we could not and will not do.
Gorbachev also related how President Reagan insisted till the end that the United States retained the right to test SDI out of the laboratory, even in space. So who, he said, would accept that? Only a madman would accept that.
At Reykjavik, and immediately after Reykjavik, we had the position that we must move on several fronts simultaneously. Strategic forces, ABM Treaty, and intermediate missiles. But then we saw that it's next to impossible because America is not ready. So we decided to unpack our package, and we have result number one.
Result number one was an agreement on intermediate-range missiles. The Soviet decision to unpack their package and separate the issues kept the scheduled Washington summit on track. Gorbachev arrived in December 1987, the first visit by a Soviet head of state in 14 years.
Mr. Gorbachev, mir na nas смотрит. The world is watching, and we've got something to show them.
For the first time in history, the superpowers agreed to eliminate a whole class of nuclear weapons. But the summit made little progress in reducing the great bulk of the world's strategic arms. An agreement still snagged on the president's commitment to his Strategic Defense Initiative. The president once again demonstrated that commitment with a visit to Martin Marietta's Denver-based astronautics group. The occasion was the dedication of a major SDI-funded project called Zenith Star.
After what I've seen today, I believe that mankind is again on the edge of a revolution that will change the basic assumptions upon which we base our decisions and reshape the world in which we live. You are laboring to develop a defensive system that will change history. You indeed are reshaping the world, and for literally all time to come. So, thank you. God bless you all.
For the president, the dream of a shield that would reshape the world was clearly still alive. But political realities were fast overtaking it. Congress, worried about its enormous cost and questionable value, was cutting back on SDI funding. In response, administration hardliners began pushing for the immediate deployment of a much less visionary defensive system.
We are now in a situation where we could, given sufficient continued funding from the Congress, we could deploy first phases of a system, I think by the end of 1994.
But it would be a system based less on futuristic beam weapons than on the old high frontier proposal to use space-based rockets to attack Soviet boosters. These rockets would be housed in garages orbiting over the Soviet Union. The first early deployment plan called for several hundred such garages. Later, the number was cut back, because of cost, to about 150. But the main burden of such a defense would fall on ground-based interceptors, similar to the old ABM rockets, but with much improved guidance systems so they could collide head-on with incoming warheads. But this politically motivated system found little political support, even from the Pentagon.
As things turn out, the Air Force will not give up one plane for an early deployment of strategic defenses. The Navy will not give up one ship. The Army will not give up one tank. The Marines will not give up one bayonet for an early deployment of strategic defenses because they think it's not militarily useful and therefore not worth the $100 billion or so that it would cost for some deployment that would really serve very little military purpose.
The only military purpose would be that of the old abandoned ABM system, protecting our deterrent. And if that's the goal, there are cheaper ways to achieve it, including making our land-based missiles mobile, as with the proposed new Midget Man missile, itself opposed by the Pentagon as too expensive. The early deployment of a partial defense would also shatter the ABM treaty, potentially triggering an all-out escalation of the arms race. But even many planned tests of the SDI could be violations of the ABM treaty and are likely to become politically controversial. Several tests are planned for the mirror system of a ground-based laser. A small mirror will be orbited and a low-power laser shown up from the ground. This test, a follow-up to an earlier experiment, probably won't encounter treaty violation complaints. But a test of a system able to discriminate between a warhead and a cloud of decoys certainly could be interpreted as a treaty violation. The giant infrared telescope designed for the test is due to be flown aboard a specially modified 767 airplane. The ABM treaty forbids tests of air-mobile components of an ABM system. Tests of ground-based interceptors are also planned, and these will raise another controversial issue. Designed to intercept warheads, as in this 1984 test, they will also be able to destroy satellites, fueling Soviet fears that a strategic defense can also be used for offense.
That's the danger, not the shield, which is technically impossible, but offensive side effects, side products, so to say. which can be very dangerous, tempting.
I asked my daddy what this Star Wars stuff is all about. He said that...
What then is Star Wars? A shield that in reality is a sword? A partial shield to enhance deterrence? Or, as in the president's original version, an impermeable shield to make nuclear missiles impotent and obsolete? How will Star Wars be remembered?
It took one man, the president, to be willing to challenge the conventional wisdom and not mind the derision and the scorn and the opposition and all the rest, and fight it through to the point where he gave the country and the world this very hopeful concept of being able to destroy these missiles and to move to a system that is designed to destroy weapons and not people.
Other presidents have not done that because they didn't feel that that was a true hope that they could hold out, and they didn't want to give the American people a false hope. I think that that hope is still a false hope, and we'll remember it as a fond hope, but a false hope.
In June 1988, President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met in Moscow.
But before things get too far out of hand,
Но пока не слишком уж далеко мы зайдем.
we find ourselves standing like this.
But still, the SDI stood between them.
SDI, in my mind, maybe some of my people wouldn't agree with me, but the whole thing was my idea, to see if there could not be developed a defensive weapon that would make it virtually impossible for nuclear missiles to get through to their targets in another country.
It doesn't meet normal logic to reduce strategic offensive arms on land and to build a bridge for such arms into outer space. Although the Americans say that this is a purely defensive weapon, we do not think that is so, and we're competent enough to make our views known. This is fraud.
No new agreements on strategic arms were negotiated in Moscow. But one of the nuclear age's most extraordinary journeys had been completed. From belligerent confrontation to a shared night at the Bolshoi. From an attempt through technology to repudiate both the power of nuclear weapons and the need for cooperation to control them, to the brink of negotiated cuts far deeper than had ever before been proposed. To the end, Ronald Reagan remained true to his personal vision of a better way to protect mankind from the threat of nuclear destruction. But in refusing to discard his dream, the president also learned that in the nuclear age, defense is no substitute for diplomacy.
Tell the people of the Soviet Union of the deep feelings of friendship felt by us and by the people of our country toward them. And tell them we will remember all of our days, their faces, the faces of hope, hope for a new era in human history, an era of peace between our nations and our peoples.